How do we see things? That's a really good question. It's really hard to answer. Partly we limit our vision. We see through a lens, and it's hard to describe what this lens is. It's the lens that allows us to use our intuitions about a situation to specify the meaning of the current moment. So imagine you're reading a book, and then you think, well, how do you read that book exactly? Do you read it letter by letter? Well, little kids do, but they don't like to read, and that's because they have to read letter by letter. You read a book letter by letter and see how much enjoyment you get out of it, right? So you get the letters automated, you build a little machine in the back of your mind that nails those letters, and then common combinations, and then you can read word by word. And then you automate that with several thousand hours of practice until you're so good at that, when you look at a word, you can't help but read it. It just goes off in your head like the word is in the outside world. Then if you keep practicing, you see phrases. And if you're really good, you start to see sentences, but you get pretty speedy at that point. Okay, so then the question is, when you're reading a book, do you read it phrase by phrase or sentence by sentence? And the answer to that is, well, no, not exactly. You read the word, you read the phrase, you read the sentence, you read the paragraph, you read the chapter, you read the book, you know the cover, you know the culture, you know the intent of the author, and all of those things are going on simultaneously while you're trying to extract meaning out of that book. So it's as if you're looking at the word through a lens made up of these successive layers of knowledge that you have that allow you to zero in on the meaning of what it is that the author is attempting to explain. And then you think, well, so think about how someone translates. You can't do it word by word. You can't do it phrase by phrase and letter by letter. Well, just forget it. And you can't get a computer to translate. Why? Well, it's because when you read something, you figure out what it means. And then you translate it so that it also means that in the next language. So it's as if the verbal portrayal is one mode of reality perception, but it translates onto another mode, and that mode is meaning, and then it can be back translated into another language, and that's how a good translator does it. And that's also why translation is an art, right? I mean, did you get the meaning right? Well, who knows? If it's a philosopher, I mean, philosophers mean a lot of different things at the same time. Question is, what's the level of reality down at which you translate the words? Well, it seems to have something to do with movement and action and behavioral output. It seems to have something to do with the fact that we have a body. It isn't a merely intellectual exercise, because when you read something and it has meaning, you think, I know what that means. And what that means is, having read this, I know how to do something differently, or I know how to conceptualize something differently so that my actions will be different in the future. And that's why we generally say, if it's fiction, say that it has a moral, right? There's a behavioral consequence. That's what the meaning of the story is. That's the point. You know, if you get the point, that means that, well, you either do something differently or you perceive and then act generally differently. And if it's really meaningful, you say, well, that changed my life. Well, what does that mean? I no longer see things the same way. That's as close to literal truth as you need. You know, I no longer think the same things are important. Well, it's important things to which you devote your action. And if the thing is powerfully meaningful, then it transforms the manner in which you act and the aims towards which you act. That's meaningful. Now, our lenses help us specify meaning. Well, you know, your lenses give you all sorts of different takes on the world. And you might think, well, are those takes real? And I would say, well, here's the odd thing. They are real, but any visual landscape is so complex that you can derive a very large number of real representations of it. So I could say, well, is a low-resolution photograph real? Is it more or less real than a high-resolution photograph? What if it's black and white? Is that less or more real than color? What if it's three-dimensional instead of two-dimensional? What if it's abstracted? Etc., etc. You can imagine how many photographs of a single object you could conceivably take. They're all slices of what that thing is, or they're representational slices of our conceptions of what it is, and they're all valid. There's a large number of valid interpretations. You know, it's a funny thing, because the humanities ran into the frame problem. Eh? The humanities run into the frame problem with postmodernism, because the postmodernists started to become aware of the fact that if you took a book there was no end to the number of interpretations you could derive from it. And so the postmodernists thought, well, then anything goes. No texts have any intrinsic meaning. Well, I don't think that's true for a variety of reasons, but it was certainly appropriate inference given what they had discovered. If you can't specify the meaning of a text, how can you be sure that it has any meaning at all? A very hard question. Well, it turns out that at least in part, meaning is dependent on the lens. So imagine this. Imagine that this is what the world's like. It's an infinite hierarchical landscape, not of objects, but of patterns. And some of those patterns are objects. Patterns that persist, for example, or patterns that persist that are useful. So if I say to you, well, what's a chair? And you say, well, a chair has 4 legs and a seat and a back. And I say, well, no, a stump doesn't have any of those, and neither does a beanbag, but they're both chairs. And so then you say, well, it's a chair if you can sit on it. And I say, well, you can sit on a table. And it turns out that defining what a chair is no easy thing, even though you know one when you see one. Well, imagine this. The world's made out of patterns. And those patterns can be interpreted in a very large number of ways. But it's more complicated than that, because your mind is made up of patterns too. And when you take your mind and the patterns that are in your mind and you apply them to the world, then what you get is an interaction between the patterns that the world is made out of and the patterns that your mind are made out of. And that's an even more complex pattern. And it has something to do with reality as such, but it also has something to do with you. And then I would say, well, the reality is actually in the interaction between the two sets of patterns. And I don't mean that metaphysically. I mean the reality is in the interactions between the two sets of patterns. And so when I said, if you want to understand what music means, you have to change the way that you think about things, what I mean is that what music speaks of is a way of understanding reality that is not like the way we understand reality, and yet it's a way that even when merely intimated, which is what music does, it grips people powerfully and in a way that cannot be rationally criticized. Unless you say that the meaning that music speaks of is not real. Well, then I would say, it depends on your definition of reality. And you know, there's lots of ways to play that game. You know, you can define thing A or thing B as real or out of reality in a variety of different ways. Well, you have to make choices about what you decide is real, right? That's why philosophers since time immemorial have pointed out that, like it or not, your existence is grounded in faith. Now, what's your lens like? I can tell you what my lens is like. So imagine I'm writing a paper, which I do fairly often. Why do I write the paper? Well, let's make it simpler. Why do I write the sentence? Well, I write the sentence to contribute to the paragraph, and I write the paragraph to contribute to the essay, and I write the essay to contribute to the paper, and I write the paper because it's part of being a scientist, and I'm a scientist because it's part of being a professor, and I'm a professor because it's part of, at least in principle, being a good citizen. And being a good citizen has a definition. In a Judeo-Christian capitalist society, being a good citizen is being a Judeo-Christian capitalist, for better or for worse. Hey. And so even when I'm engaged in something as potentially trivial as writing a single sentence in an essay, all of those sources of knowledge bear on it simultaneously, and that's what helps me specify its meaning. And you can't say that any one of those levels of analysis is more real than any other. Now, you can say it's more pragmatically worthwhile to focus on a certain level at a certain point in time, but I'll tell you, if I get a paper that's rejected badly enough, which happens fairly often, I don't start thinking, well, the sentence was wrong. I start thinking, I'm a pretty awful scientist, and therefore I must not be a very good professor, and that puts the whole productive citizen thing in doubt. And you think hard about that for a bit, and you'll understand real quick why people don't like other people who mess around with their presuppositions, right? Because it goes pretty quickly up the old reality hierarchy from you have a stupid idea to your moral grip on your privileged position is unjustifiable. Well, let's take a simple lens. Okay, how do you look at the world? Well, you're a motivated creature and you're alive and you're always doing something, fiddling around with something. You know, in the old Mesopotamian creation myths, the goddess who lived underneath everything, she'd always come up in a terribly destructive roar because people were running around on the planet doing things and disturbing her. Well, we still believe that, right? Because we believe if we mess around with the environment long enough, all hell's going to break loose. But, you know, we're always running around messing things up. That's what we do, right? We're going from point A to point B, and you know how it is. You have a goal, you pursue it, you get the goal. As soon as you get the goal, you have another goal, and you pursue that. As soon as you get that, it's Sisyphus. Roll the rock up the hill, rolls down the hill. Roll it up the hill, rolls down the hill. Eventually you get tired of that and you die. You're stuck in one of these, eh? And it gives your life value, because it turns out that the way your emotional systems work is that they only work if you have a goal. So you have a goal, whatever that is, and then anything that happens to you that puts you closer to the goal, that makes you happy. And it turns on your systems that make you go ahead, move forward, be attracted to. Anything that gets in the way of your goal, depending on its potency, produces negative emotion. Anxiety, frustration, disappointment, shame, guilt, anger. It stops you or makes you move backwards. You're a pretty simple creature in some ways. You're going somewhere. If things are going well, you're happy. Because happy means things are going well in progression to a goal. And if they aren't, you're not happy. Forward, stop, reverse. Forward is happy, stopped is anxious, reverse is frustration, disappointment, pain. We're linear creatures and we're always on the move. And we look at the world through a motivated lens, right? This isn't secondary. It's not after perception. It informs perception itself. Which means really that you can't look at the world without wanting something. And which also means that the way the world looks to you depends on what you want. Now that's a scary thought. What do you see when you're looking at the world? Well, you see, they're not objects. They've been called affordances. You see things that have relevance to you. Well, a thing has to persist a bit for it to be relevant to you. So a lot of the things that we see are objects, but not everything. Here's an ad hoc category. Firemen can see this, but other people can't. Things to take out of your apartment while it's burning down. Okay, now that's a category, right? You can even imagine that as a perceptual category, but the things that it contains share virtually no objective features. Pets, spouses, probably. Things of sentimental value. Money. Well, then maybe the list gets more difficult to define, but you understand, you see, that the goal there, which is to get out of the apartment before you die with some things of value, defines what you see. And you may object, well, I wouldn't actually see that. And I would say, oh yeah, you would. If you're looking at a bowl of fruit and it has 3 bananas and 2 apples and an orange in it, and I ask you what that is, and you say it's a bowl of fruit, what you see is fruit, not 2 apples and whatever I mentioned, 2 bananas, 2 apples and a peach. You see fruit. You see what you categorize, or opposite, you categorize when you see. So you're moving along from where you are to where you want to go, and you parse the world up into useful things that get you to where you want to go, and annoying things that don't. And if everything works out fine, well, you get here, then you have a new one of these. But there's a catch. Now here's the catch. When you look at the world, you hardly see anything that's there. You know, you're simplifying things. But everything that you don't see is still there. So imagine that you're inhabiting this little sort of simplified and somewhat perfected domain all the time. It's wandering around you. It's part of what you inhabit. But the real world, whatever that is out there. Now I've often thought about the story of in Genesis, you know, the story of Adam and Eve in that regard. Because what you have there is a kind of paradise where everything's really going well. And you know, you've all lived in a paradise like that when things were going really well, right? But there's always snakes in those paradises. And the reason for that is just because things are going well doesn't mean you've accounted for everything. And you can't account for everything. So there's always something lurking around from underneath. And if you go and mess with that thing, then all hell breaks loose. And you think, well, has that ever happened to you? Well, sure. It happens to you if you have a relationship and the person you're having a relationship with cheats on you. That's a snake for sure. It happens to you if you're well and then you're not. It happens to you if you're dependent on a family member and they die. Right? It's the unrevealed complexity of the world that manifests itself suddenly, that wreaks havoc on our little paradises. Well, and we're so damn curious, eh? We just can't leave well enough alone. That's human beings for sure, right? Just like the Catholics say, heritable sin, right? You put people in a paradise and you tell them not to do one thing, and you can bloody well be sure that's the first thing they're going to do. Because we're so curious, we cannot leave things alone. We're always unraveling sweaters and looking at things we're not supposed to look at, and so on and so forth. And, you know, it's a great thing, and we learn a lot, but we pay a big price for it. The question is, what do you look at when you don't know what you see? What is it that you see when you don't know what you see? So think about it this way. This is a very, very hard thing to understand. Remember when the towers fell? What did you see? Well, you say, well, I saw the towers fall. And I'd say, no, no, no. If all you saw was that the towers fell, you wouldn't have looked at it 50 times. Why did you have to look at it 50 times? Well, because you couldn't believe it. Well, what did that mean? It meant that the event was so complex that you couldn't perceive it. What fell? The monetary system in the U.S., the Western economy. It was the transformation of the Cold War. It was a new paradigm. It was a battle between good and evil. That popped up pretty quick, like the next day, pretty much. You had to look at it over and over and over and over because you didn't know what you were seeing. You didn't know how to see what you were seeing. And you think, okay, I don't quite get that. And then I would think, okay, when you're driving your car and it breaks down, what is it when it breaks down? And you might say, it's a car. And I would say, if you persist on thinking that that thing that isn't moving is a car, you're going to have nothing but frustration. Because what it is now is a very complex assemblage of parts you don't understand, one of which is key to transforming it back into a car. And so what happens is that it reveals itself suddenly as a consequence of its non-compliance with your wishes as the complex structured entity that it actually is. And you have to go pay a mechanic, because the mechanic knows the magic sequence that will turn this intransigent bit of complex junk back into the simple thing that you can drive to work. Well, and you'll pay for that, right? Because it's valuable. Because for you to get that thing back to being a car, it'd take you maybe 10 years. Because what do you know? And you're more likely to make it worse. The mechanic will just go, tap. And you'll say, well, you've charged me $500 for that. And he'll say, well, it's a savings for you, right? You don't know where to tap. It's a long trip.